talking about all of you to our speaker. Many of you before you arrived, and I'm still looking out there, and I don't see some of our favorite
chatters.
You're all now wondering what I'm going to say. Where's Forrest? I didn't say that. Housekeeping, just very briefly. How many of you did not receive the package of materials on homelessness? Sue, Jacques, and Ursula. And Don, you didn't read this? Oh, gosh. I'll have to talk to my administrative assistant.
There she is.
No, that's Vanna White. She just carries the mic. Got lots of seating up front. Somehow Google contacts every once in a while. I'll drop a name, and I'm sorry for that. I'll put your names back in and endeavor not to have that happen. Although it's beyond me how it happens. Anybody here who's new for the first time? Good morning. Welcome. And I'd like to send you materials too, and or lose your name on the contact list. If you just make sure that I have your email address and name, we'll add you to the team. For those of you who did get the package, you know that our guest today is Shannon Nasworth. She is the CEO of Ability Housing. Ability is the largest supplier of permanent housing for the homeless in North and Central Florida. Can I say that? Mm-hmm. There are temporary homeless providers, and that is essentially, it is what it is, what it sounds like. It's a temporary solution to a problem. Shannon's company, which you didn't start, but you've been with it for a long time, recognizes, and appropriately so, that the solution is not a transient solution, although there is such a thing as transient homelessness. There is a need for permanent solutions to the problem of homelessness. This was a main part of the material I sent out, but I learned it. I was briefly on Shannon's board and really loved every minute of it because I was so happy to be a part of what they were doing. But I learned the concept of housing first, that addicts are more likely to go to meetings and the mentally ill more likely to take their drugs from a house, a home, than they are from a bench. Seems just so absolutely obvious that how could we miss it? But it's a policy that makes sense. Well, that's enough introduction. Shannon, I'm going to let you. Shannon's going to talk for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll do Q&A. So think hard about your questions, and off we go. Shannon?
Thank you very much. Okay, so as you heard, I'm the president of Ability Housing. We're a Jacksonville-based nonprofit affordable housing developer. So we actually started as a group home for 6 young ladies with developmental disabilities. It was started by a mom. And not surprising, those young women, when the time came and their independent living skills had increased, wanted to move on, and they could not find an affordable place to live. The organization at that time was called Grove House because there was an orange grove in the backyard of the group home. Is that better? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so Grove House also became the largest provider of independent living services in Northeast Florida. And serving persons with disabilities, they realized that one of the biggest challenges everyone had was finding a place they could afford to live. So the solution they came up with was buying a few single-family homes in Duval County and providing them very affordably to adults with disabilities. They were just rentals, no on-site staff, not a group home or anything like that. I was brought on, as Bob said, in the mid-2000s when the decision was made to take that housing program and turn it into a standalone nonprofit. And that is what Ability Housing is today. We are dedicated solely to making sure that every one of our neighbors has a place they can afford to live. We are not going to achieve that goal, but we are going to work real hard towards it, and we are also going to try to create an ecosystem that is working towards it. Today, Ability Housing is one of the leaders in our industry. We're one of the few nonprofits in Florida able to develop affordable rental housing. We started here in Jacksonville. We now own 6 apartment communities in Jacksonville, as well as 29 single-family houses. And because of our success, we were asked to expand to Central Florida. Mayor Dyer and then Mayor Jacobs asked us to come to Orange County. And so we now own 2 apartment communities in Orange County and 1 in Osceola. For a total, in addition to that, one of the other things we do through a HUD grant is we master lease over 100 units from other landlords in the community so that we can provide those to formerly homeless individuals. So altogether, we're providing housing every day to 815 individuals and families that did not have a home. Not all of our housing is dedicated solely to the homeless. Some of it is affordable housing for working families that just cannot afford market housing. And we can have a whole conversation about the housing market and how it has just, wages have not kept up with the cost of housing. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with that. And if you're a renter, the difference is astronomical. Harvard did an analysis a few years ago, and since the 60s, housing costs have gone up 60-something%. The median wage of renter households went up 5%. So we're just dealing with a fundamental market failure. Housing is not affordable to a large segment of our community. I will give you a few numbers just so you can understand the scope. Every year, HUD asks every community to do a one-time, point-in-time count. On one day, go out and try to identify everybody who's homeless on that day. It doesn't tell you everyone who's homeless, but it is a good way to have a snapshot barometer of how we're doing with the rate of homelessness in our communities. According to the 2020 Council on Homelessness report for Duval County, on one day in January, it was 1,494 people were identified as literally homeless. Of those, 301 or 20% had a disability and had been homeless for a very long time. 118 or 8% were veterans, and 289 households or 19% were families with children. In St. Johns County, it was 368 persons were identified as homeless. 43 or 12% were chronic, meaning disability and long-term. Veterans were 25, families were 94. But in addition to our literally homeless, every year our public schools try to identify the students that are homeless or unstably housed and at risk of homelessness. This is very important because, as we know, if a child is unstably housed, they're going to perform worse in school. They're going to have increased behavioral issues, they're going to have tardiness, absenteeism, they're going to score much worse on all of the standardized tests, they're going to have challenges building relationships with teachers and others in the community. So we try every year to identify any child that is unstably housed or homeless so that we can identify resources and help their families so they don't lose their housing and become homeless. So for the last school year, Duval County identified 3,770 students that were homeless at some point during the year. In St. Johns County, it was 732 of our students. So almost every school has at least one child. Every school has somebody who's struggling. And those are only the ones we identify, and those are only the ones who are in our public schools. It doesn't include their younger siblings, and it doesn't include any older siblings that might have aged out or dropped out of school. So that's just to give a feel for the numbers. Homelessness in general, we've been doing a really good job. I do want to say, we one time, way back in the day, did not have systemic homelessness in our country. Back in the 1970s, we actually had more affordable housing than we had need. There were more units that were affordable to low-income and extremely low-income families than there were families that needed that housing. Not by a whole lot, a very slim margin, but we had an adequate supply of affordable housing. In the mid-'80s, due to public policy choices, we stopped investing in housing that was affordable to those households. We also deinstitutionalized persons with mental illness, and so we started seeing a lot of people living on our streets, but we also saw the beginning of systemic homelessness. In homelessness, there's a spectrum of individuals and families, and at one end, you have the chronically homeless. 15 to 20%, depending upon your community, are people with disabilities, co-occurring disorders, complex multiple health conditions. They are going to need a lot of assistance to find housing, maintain that housing. They're not going to be able to have jobs that afford market housing. They're going to need rental assistance. They're going to need supports. They're going to need access to behavioral and primary health care. But the only way to help them get off the street is to provide what's called permanent supportive housing. Deeply affordable housing with individualized wraparound supports. The other end of the spectrum, about 20% as well, are people who are having a one-time short financial crisis. They will probably self-resolve their issue, maybe just a little bit of help, 1 month's rent, fix the car so they can keep going to work, those types of things. The vast majority of persons experiencing homelessness are in the middle, and the majority of their reasons is economics. They can't afford the housing. They cannot find a place they can afford to live. It's not that they can't find housing they want that they can afford, they can't find any housing that they can afford. And as I just told you, it's because our wages have not kept up with housing costs. The resolution for those households typically is called rapid rehousing. And the objective there is to do the lightest touch possible to help that family get into a place to live, provide them the wraparound supports and rental assistance for as short a term as possible so that they can self-resolve. It is very successful. Most of the people that our first area of success in this has been among veterans. For many years, we've been trying to end veteran homelessness in the United States. They were the first group to really lean in on creating rapid rehousing programs to help veterans and their families who are homeless. And the data is showing us that they do not return to homelessness. They may not stay in the house or apartment that they moved into in the program, but that stability gives them the opportunity to find other solutions that are stable housing. It may be reuniting with family. It could be finding another family that they want to live with, the Kate and Allie solution, as I like to call it. Finding somebody else and living together to create the affordability. The vast majority of those individuals do not return to homelessness. I cannot tell you what the impacts of COVID are going to be on homelessness. Really, the data is not there. We've had a lot of challenges. I'm sure you saw in the news. We had a tent camp arise in downtown Jacksonville because so many people, are in desperate need of a place to live, and jobs have been, up until recently, employment was a very huge issue for all of our individuals. There is a myth that homeless people don't work. That's actually not true. Except for the persons with disabilities, most homeless people have a job. One of the people we housed was a veteran who was working at Talleyrand. He lived in a tent in the woods outside of Talleyrand because he needed to be at work early in the morning, and the buses don't run that early. So to make sure he didn't lose his job, he would sleep in a tent and then walk into work all day, and go back to his tent. So these are very hardworking, resourceful individuals. Candidly, and I'm very grateful, I cannot say I'm speaking from experience, these are individuals who have survival instincts and abilities that I am awed by every day. One of our board members, who is a former resident, she's a mom with 3 kids. She worked for Bank of America, lost her job, this was several years ago, lost her job, couldn't find another one, was evicted from her apartment, and literally was, as she says, that one of those stereotypical moms driving around in her car with her kids, all of their clothes in laundry baskets. Sometimes they would break back into the apartment they'd been evicted from just so her kids could have a place to sleep at night. They couch surfed, they went to families and friends, they bounced around, and then they found ability housing. We were able to give them an affordable place they could live with some rental assistance, help her get some access to some job referrals, get the kids back in stable school, and now she has a full-time job. She is a dedicated caseworker helping other families get out of homelessness. She works for Family Promise. Homelessness is unique and individual to each person, but there are systemic reasons why we have homelessness. The primary one is the lack of affordable housing. Homelessness is primarily a resource issue. Yes, some people have mental health and or substance use issues. There are many people with mental health and substance use issues who are not homeless because they can afford their home. Substance use and mental health do not cause homelessness. They may exacerbate the ability to get out of homelessness, but they do not cause homelessness. Again, primarily homelessness is a resource issue. I'm really excited that Bob invited me here. I'm very proud of the Ability Housing team because we really do approach everything from an evidence-based, research, data-driven practice. We have found Housing First to be incredibly impactful. It is counterintuitive. I will be very honest, when I started here, I did not know homelessness. I didn't know supportive housing. I didn't know persons with disabilities other than lame persons' understanding of all of these things. But I was really lucky at the time that I was asked to take this on. There was a lot of research on best practices of what to do to address these issues, and I just Googled a heck of a lot. One of the key solutions is housing first. And I'll be honest, when I first read about it, moving somebody in straight from the streets into a place seemed counterintuitive to me. I was conditioned to think you have to get housing ready. First you move into the shelter and you take care of these issues, and then you move into a transitional housing program and take care of these issues, and we solve all of your problems, get you the perfect job, and then we'll move you into housing because we don't want to set you up for failure. Very well intentioned, absolutely wonderful things. But in the end, we're really causing and delaying returning to housing. What helped me finally understand why Housing First works is Maslow's hierarchy. It is simply, if you are worried about where you're going to sleep tonight and if you're going to eat, food and shelter, we all need food and shelter. If you have those, if you have the security of a place to sleep at night, if you can lock your door, if you can put your medicine in the refrigerator, if you know that your wife is going to be safe and you don't have to stay up all night to make sure she's going to be okay, you can sleep. You can then take a breath, get the stability, and start kicking in with the executive functioning. If you're in crisis mode, the human body does not permit you to do planning for tomorrow, next week, next month, or next year. You're worrying about today, where you're going to sleep tonight, what you're going to do. If you get the stability of a place to live, then you can avail yourself of the services. No caseworker, no matter how awesome they are, can provide the level of services somebody needs when they're on the streets. If that same person has the stability of a home, that same caseworker can help them, and the progression of that individual will be so much faster. It just makes sense if you think about from the personal standpoint of the stress of being homeless, the worry of where are my kids going to sleep tonight, are we going to eat, are we going to be safe? If you can take those stressors away, then you can start thinking about tomorrow, you can start worrying about school more, you can start worrying about your job, all of those things. So Housing First really does work, but as I believe Bob said in an article, it is not housing only. You do not just move them into housing and then expect them to be okay. Some will, and I will tell you, having done this for many years now, I will never ever bet what individual is going to need what level of care once they move into the housing. I've had people that were on the street for over 10 years, had all sorts of issues, and I really thought this is going to be fun. We're going to have this is going to be very intensive. We're going to have a lot of supports. We're going to have to really lean in and help this individual be successful. And really, they just needed the right medication, and they're fine. 8 months later, asked if they can move out because they'd gotten a job and they can afford a place to live without our assistance. Others, I thought, not so bad. It's not going to be that big a deal. They might need some help, some financial assistance, but they're not going to need the intensive services. Turns out they have significant barriers, and they're really going to need a lot of assistance. So I am not a person who can look at an individual who is homeless and tell you how they're going to progress once they move into the housing. What I can tell you is that the majority of them will maintain stable housing and progress in their abilities and their family's trajectory. I will say Ability Housing, with our 815 units of housing, traditionally 95 to 96% of our residents retain stable housing. We define that as they keep stable housing for 12 or more months. Does not mean they're staying in our housing. It may mean they left our housing to other stable housing, but they have not returned to homelessness. So 96% of our residents maintain stable housing. And of that 4% that fail, we always try to have a soft exit so that they can come back when they want to try again. Because life is about second and sometimes third and fourth chances. And, we've been really lucky here in Northeast Florida. We have a wonderful network of nonprofits that work very collaboratively together. We really try to help each other do better so that we can meet the person where they're at, get them the supports that they need, and help them identify their goals. In supportive housing, the most important thing is to help the person identify their goals, develop their plan for achieving that goal, and then hold them accountable to that plan. We do that with case managers who are specially trained in supportive housing, as well as certified peer support specialists. Certified peer supports are individuals who have been there. They are peers. They have lived this life. They have experienced homelessness, mental health, substance use, whatever. And they can have an interaction with the individuals unlike things that we can have because they've been there and they understand. And candidly, they can have the conversation with the person that others can't have. They can remind them, yeah, you might want to go do X, but you said your goal was to achieve this. If you do this, are you really on your path to your goal? And just help people remember what they're trying to achieve in their lives. I don't know what else you want me to help people to know about homelessness. I've gone my 15 minutes, so.
I could listen to you for longer, but my turn is on.
I could listen to you for a long time. I'd like to ask just a couple of quick questions just to confirm what you said. The 20% that are chronic and the 20% that are short-term, those are problems I suppose most of us can understand. You temporarily lose your job or you're displaced, a home breaks up. That's 60% in the middle. You're saying they're homeless because you said resource constrained. It's not so much their resources, it's the absence of affordable housing. It just doesn't exist.
Right now in Florida, the United Way does an analysis every year they call ALICE, Asset Limited Income Constrained Employed. These are working families. And they do an analysis of how many families in Florida can afford basic living, not anything grand, including childcare. Over 45% of all working families in Florida can't afford their daily life. Those are people who are in crisis. Those are people who are at risk of becoming homeless or are homeless. Those are the people we're talking about. They are working, but their employment does not support rent, childcare, car, food, clothing.
Amazing. We talked earlier, Shannon and I, before the meeting started, about some of the cities that we see in the news more often than we certainly do St. Augustine or Jacksonville, Los Angeles and Seattle and Portland, where there are these large tent communities. Again, thinking about that division of chronic, short-term, and then the 60% in the middle, part of the reason those tent cities exist, as I understand it, is that if you combine the cost of the house plus the cost of transportation from your place of employment, the solution in Los Angeles, where I've lived before, is to just move further and further and further away from town, because if you get far enough away, you can afford the house. But the cost of work is the house you live in plus the cost of transportation. When those two exceed your income, and when you think about the growing disparity in income, at the bottom of that income scale, you reach the point where what you're paid may equal the cost of the house you found way out there. It may pay for the cost of transportation, can't pay for both.
Actually, right now in the country, if you take the cost of housing plus the cost of transportation, Orlando is the most expensive community in the country to live in. You have to commute so far out. It's one, low wages, tourism industry, so we're starting at a low wage base for the majority of median employment. And so to find a place you can afford the cost of the transportation to get back to your job, it is the most expensive community in the country.
Which is mind-boggling. I don't even think of that as an issue here. Carol, start the questions.
Yes. What?
Wait for Ken. Thank you.
What is the main reason for the veterans' homelessness?
It's a combination. We have had a lot of issues with veterans exiting service and having mental health issues and becoming homeless. Sometimes one of the big issues is family breakup. Most people who are homeless the night before had a home, but when families break, one of the people has to leave that house, and it's usually not planned, and so they become homeless. And so we're trying to have systems. Our goal collectively is we're not going to end homelessness. We realize that. Well, people will have housing crises. There will be, breakups, things like that. The difference between now and before is back in the 1970s when that family broke up, it might be a few days, you might have to couch surf and get a motel room, but you could find a place you could afford. The difference is today you can't find that place you can afford. And so that's our big issue. And then there also are just disproportionate mental health issues amongst our veteran population. But the VA has really been very intentional in working with all of the other nonprofits. We are really trying hard, and in Jacksonville doing really well, trying to end homelessness among our veteran population. It has gone down more than most communities in our country.
Bob?
First of all, do you have a screening mechanism for people that you can't accept?
So, as I mentioned, the nonprofits are all working together. One of the things we've done is created a coordinated entry system. So anybody who needs help in the homeless system can go to one place rather than knocking on every door and trying to get what they can. There's one place, they will do an assessment. There's actually a national, it's called a VI-SPDAT. Do not ask me what those initials stand for, it's really long. But it is a national assessment tool that helps identify what is the right intervention for that family. They go through that process. If our housing is the right option for them, then they're referred to us, and if we have an available unit, we will take that referral.
And also, do you have some sort of target for minorities to make sure that you're servicing them?
Right now in the homeless system, there is a high disproportionate number of African Americans that are homeless. So we don't really have to worry about, we take the referral. So whoever is identified as most vulnerable, most at risk of dying on our streets first, we will take them first, regardless of race. But unfortunately, racial inequities in the homeless system are very real. Ability Housing actually is participating with a national group trying to do what's called a data for equity analysis, to do some analyses of our systems and try to find out how we can do a better job with the racial inequities within the system. And there are challenges, absolutely.
And do you have a maximum period of time that you will house them and then they have to move along?
No, our housing is housing just like anything you live in. So as long as they're abiding by their lease, they have all the rights and responsibilities of any other leaseholder in the community. So if they want to renew their lease, we will renew their lease. However, with the supports and things that we provide, we really are trying to help them achieve the ability to move on. If they are chronically homeless, with disabilities and such, they're going to be with us for a very long time, possibly until they need higher medical care, because their income is never going to be at a point where they can afford anything other than deeply affordable housing. For others, 2 to 3 years on average is about how long they stay before they're able to find other housing options.
Ken has a question. Ken, before he asks, let me just report something. When I first joined their board, I went to a housing community on the west side, and I forget what the name was. Wiley. And there was the manager of the facility had just joined because it was a new project that Ability built. And he explained their screening process. And he said it's quite different from what he'd come as a property manager from another development. And he said, we ask questions like if they have a record of incarceration, a record of not paying their bills, of addiction. He said, and how we used to do that is every time people would say they'd been incarcerated or addicted or failed to pay their bill, we'd say, you can't come here. Now it's just the opposite. We screen them in, we don't screen them out. Ken?
Yes. What is the sources of your financing?
So we exist on 3 buckets of financing. One is the money to do the construction of the property, so to acquire or build new construction. We rely very heavily on federal programs. The largest program for developing affordable rental housing in our country is called Low-Income Housing Tax Credits. It's an IRS program. That is our biggest source for developing the housing. There are other HUD and like programs that we get that are passed through by the city or the state. For the programs themselves, the rental assistance and the wraparound supports, we have grants from the state through the Department of Children and Families for Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services, and then grants from HUD to provide rental assistance and a little bit of the money for the services to help the formerly chronically homeless individuals. Those resources are targeted to the chronically homeless. And then for our operating as the office, we rely on philanthropic support as well as earned income. When we develop a property, part of that development is a fee to the developer to offset our overhead costs necessary to create housing. So those are our 3 buckets of financing.
Sue, do you want to go first? We'll come back to him. Here in the front row, Sue Trudeau.
I have a comment. Last night I was watching HGTV, and this family of a man and wife and a small child were looking for a house in Englewood, California. And they looked at this dumpy little 1,000 square foot house, 1 bathroom, 2 bedrooms, on the market for $600,000. So that's where the market is. It's ridiculous. And number 2, if you have the property provided to you, would you consider using shipping cartons to make little tiny houses?
We will consider anything. For us, it comes down to the finances. Shipping containers can be more financially viable, and you don't know what the underlying structure is when you do the housing. I've seen projects where you don't know that the underlying structure was shipping containers. We're open to anything as long as it's cost effective. Candidly, frequently, shipping containers don't tend to be as cost effective as people thought it was going to be. But if the numbers work, we will do whatever, because there is no one answer to this. We want to create all the housing options we possibly can.
As some of you may know, and I'll just, John, just excuse me, some of you may know, we're involved in a thing called Sister Parish Ministry of the Dominican Republic. We've built 60 houses, 65 houses in the last few years for the very poor there in the DR. We looked at shipping containers as an option, thinking, what a great idea. Boy, by the time you ventilate it, air condition it, or somehow allow for circulation, put it on a foundation, it just isn't the bargain that we thought it would be. We could stick build with concrete foundation, blocks up to 30 inches, and then wood framing above that for 60% of the cost of a finished shipping container. It looks good, makes sense, a lot of them available. The numbers just didn't work out. Don, go ahead with your question, then we'll go back to...
We have a question here too.
We have you mentioned the veterans. Does the Veterans Administration get physically involved in your projects and in helping in dealing with these people that are, quote, veterans?
The VA and the projects themselves, meaning constructing the properties, no. Are they providing referrals and support services to veterans? Yes. Sometimes their services are the only services the person needs, and that's all they get. Sometimes they need additional services, and we'll work with the VA providers as part of the healthcare system.
Actually, Carol, would you mind if we start with Phoebe first, because you've asked one. We'll come back to you. Phoebe?
Yeah, about your plan for building housing. I lived in a building in New York City after I sold my big co-op. It was a rental, and 30% of the building, it was a beautifully built building right on the Hudson River on the west side, 62nd Street about. And the 30% of those people were policemen, nursing students, nurses, doctors that were not yet not yet professional. They were doing their internships and residencies, and musicians from Lincoln Center, ballet dancers from Lincoln Center, et cetera, et cetera. So these weren't people that had been on the street, but they would have been if they hadn't been able to get affordable housing. And they were perfectly nice people to live with. But what do you do when that person goes to a higher level of income? How do you monitor getting them into higher paying? They can afford it, but they may not want to leave. I mean, this building was lovely. Had a beautiful gym and a concierge and a doorman and a playground in the front, river views. So how do you do that? You just say, I got to see your income tax returns every year?
Actually, because of the financing we receive, we do have to income certify every year for lease renewal. We do have to do a recertification of their income. They are allowed to increase their income some, because we don't want to disincent people to work more, but there's a cap at how high it's allowed to go. It depends on the property. If we have other units that are at a higher income limit with a higher rent, we can just We don't actually physically swap units, we just kind of we change the designations because they physically look like the identical units. Or, you know, we just, when we realize it, they tend to know, because there's obviously lots of communication, they'll already start looking for another place. Again, most of our people stay 2 to 3 years unless they have a lot of barriers.
Carol?
I'm familiar with some churches that have a program, I think it's called Promise,
Family Promise, yes.
where they convert their fellowship halls on the weekend to places for beds for people. Do you work with them, or is that effective in Jacksonville?
We work with Family Promise. In fact, that board member I was discussing works for them. And so what Family Promise is churches get together and they provide emergency shelter for families. And what we do, we're kind of the outlet. So we are, when they are working with a family and they are trying to help them find a place to move into, we're one of the places they'll refer to.
Doug?
Yes, this is a question with respect to a specific individual. He's 29 years old, homeless, does have a drug problem. He is willing to go into treatment, but does not have a place to live. His income, he is on disability for some mental health issues. He has $780 a month from disability. He is on food stamps. He gets $196 a month on food stamps, and he is registered on Medicaid. What he does now is he basically, I guess, plays the daily lottery at Trinity and City Rescue Mission. When he's finally at the point that his wit's end, he'll walk up to a police officer, indicate he's going to kill himself. At that point, the police officer will have him Baker Acted, and that's good for 3 days of room and board at a local mental health facility. So that's what he's doing now. But if he could have, I'm going to agree with you on the housing first, but if he can get the housing settled, then you can start looking at the substance abuse.
Absolutely. In fact, the Journal of American Medical Association has done several articles. Even when sobriety is not a requirement or a target for the households, most often the individual will choose to try and become sober, because once you get the housing, you do not want to continue the behavior that could put that housing at risk.
I forgot to mention, he also has a felony record.
Again, so as Bob was mentioning, our motto is to screen in. There are a few things, child predators, those types of things, yeah, we're just not going to do that. But the vast majority, I think there's 5 things on our list that for criminal backgrounds that are not permitted at our properties. Other than that, we're about second chances. People make mistakes. I don't know if people are aware, but if you drive on a suspended license in Florida, that's a felony. So if you don't make one child support payment, we use our driver's license as a tool here, so you'll be driving on a suspended license. You've got to go to work to pay that child support, so you drive on a suspended license, you get arrested, that's a felony. So, that's just one example of systemic issues that lead to bad outcomes. The intent behind it, one, the outcome, the other. For that individual, honestly, if you want, I'll give you my card and you can call the office afterwards. We can give some referrals and help him know where to go for the coordinated entry. The police, I'm sure, probably know it already. Unfortunately, we do not have options for everybody. There's no room at the inn, so to speak. But we do keep lists. We, the collective, we keep lists and try our street. When I say we at this moment, I'm talking about the system. The nonprofits that work together, we have street outreach. We will try to keep them engaged so that if something becomes available for him, we can know where he is, get him, and then move him in. One of my staff is a veteran who used to do street outreach and now works for us. And one of his favorite things is when he gets to go and find somebody literally on a park bench and say, "We've got your unit. Come on, let's go get in the car," and just pick him up and take him to the apartment, and the guy gets in place.
Another issue that he has is he has no address. I guess I've covered that in the short term, but if there's some way where there could be, I don't know, I just say the Ajax Church, that, well, his address is, box 29, Ajax Church, whatever the street address is.
So what I would recommend is he go to the Salzbacher Center. The city has funding, and there's other nonprofits there called a day rest stop, where several service providers are there, and they can help him with things like that. They also have showers and things like that. So if he goes to the Salzbacher Center, downtown, he will be familiar with where it is. they can help him access, and again, he needs to be on the list so we at least know where he is on the vulnerability scale, so when something becomes available, we can try and find him and move him in.
Have any of you heard of St. Francis Soup Kitchen downtown? I was working there one day, and there's a requirement that the people who we feed give us their address because of some federal assistance, I think, that we get some stipend. And after about the 7th person gave me the same address, I turned to one of my coworkers and I said, God, is there this big building down the street here? He laughed at me and said, none of these people live in a home or an apartment. They live in the park. They all have to give you an address. So they're all at 79 Church Street or wherever it was. A little naive. John.
Are you currently expanding your inventory?
Are you expanding your inventory now?
We are always trying to do more housing. We actually applied for an affordable housing property here in St. Johns County. Our lottery number was not good enough, so we weren't selected for financing because all of the affordable housing resources are extremely oversubscribed. They get about 10 to 15 applications for every project they're able to fund. But we are always looking. We have one property in St. Johns County we're definitely trying to get financing for, 4 others in Duval, and 2 to 3 in Central Florida that we're trying to get the financing for.
So these are multi-unit developments that you're thinking about? Okay.
Yes, we've done single-family rentals, and they're just harder to manage, because they're spread out, and it's just financially bang for the buck. You get more units per person or per dollar if you do multifamily.
Ken, Carol's got another question. We're going to give Carol a mic. And certainly the forces here will just keep
For that 20% who have mental health problems, who provides that type of intense counseling for them? Because I wouldn't imagine you, if you're in the housing business, can do that.
Oh, no, we don't do mental health services. What our case managers do is help them connect to whatever the other supports they need in the community. So it might be Gateway if it's substance use, Mental Health Resource Center, Renaissance Behavioral Health, Northwest Behavioral Health. There's different behavioral health providers that are specialists in that. And then, we will connect them with different federally qualified health clinics for their primary care. One of the big challenges is dental care and trying to find resources for dental care. So we don't do the mental health services ourselves or the substance use. We do partner with the nonprofits that do that. Sometimes they'll bring programs on site, but other times it's referring out, and then we help them get to it if they need a bus pass or transportation to get to their appointments, that type of thing.
Gordon?
How are you staffed to monitor how people are performing and doing and so forth, and do you keep records and so forth?
So as a landlord, we have on-site property management, so they do the typical things that property managers do. They make sure the leases are up to date, they collect the rent, they do the maintenance. We make sure the units are in good condition and those types of things. So very typical property management type of behaviors. We then also have on-site case managers and peer supports who are available to anybody, whether they are formerly homeless or not, because sometimes our not formerly homeless families have a crisis and they need assistance getting resources. And again, we have a database that we keep all of the notes and records and referrals to other nonprofits or medical care or whatever it is that they need. And then at an agency level, we monitor on a routine basis what are our outcomes, how are our residents doing, how many people are retaining stable housing, how many people are getting access to benefits that they're eligible for that they might not have been getting before, how many have increased income, and then at the properties, we're monitoring what's rent collection, what's occupancy, is it well maintained, all the things that anybody who owns a property who's in it for the long term especially, because once we own a property, we're in it for 40 or 50 years. We want that well maintained. We're not looking to flip and make a profit off of a sale.
Charlie?
A number of years ago when I was living in Manhattan, I was a volunteer with a group of people, I think they were church connected, that dealt with homeless people. Specifically, my job was to help them get ready for a new job, how to interview, etc. Invariably, they were all from broken homes. There was no family as such existing. They were individuals. And some of them had had rather good jobs at one point, and then they went off the rails for whatever reason. I guess my question is, do you see this as part of a larger problem?
Absolutely. I will say the only indicator of, or predictor of homelessness is prior homelessness. That is the only thing that is a good predictor if somebody will become homeless. Not income, not mental health, not substance use, not any of those things. If you've been homeless before, the probability of your becoming homeless again is much higher. So if you are a child who has experienced homelessness, the probability that you will become homeless as an adult is much stronger. For domestic violence, there are a lot of women who stay, and men, who stay in houses because they don't want to become homeless. They'll stay in a very abusive situation because otherwise they and their children are going to become homeless. Broken families, economically, it doesn't work. So if you're a struggling family as a couple and you split, a struggling family is much harder. And a lot of the times, by the time, especially if you're a long-term homeless, you've couch surfed, you've tapped out all of your friends and family, you've burned some bridges, and you're on your own. And one of the great successes is when we can get people reunited with their families, and it is a nice, really great outcome.
Cool. John?
I was wondering a couple of things, and they might have been alluded to already. One is there a correlation between education level and homelessness? My other question was, what is your opinion of how the federal government is dealing with the homeless problem? I think that if you can answer those two, that'll do me.
Okay, so for the first one, because education correlates to income, yes, there is a correlation between education and homelessness. Not that highly educated people can't become homeless, but
it may correlate to income. But once you're homeless, then it correlates with homelessness itself. So that doesn't seem to be a valid.
Well, I'm saying that the education correlates to homelessness because of its correlation to income being one of the causes of homelessness. The inability to afford housing is the primary cause of homelessness. So if you have poor education, which leads to poor jobs with lower wages, the likelihood that you can't afford your housing is higher, therefore the likelihood of your becoming homeless is higher. That does not mean that higher educated people can't become homeless. People, I was at a conference and a gentleman who had been a news person for ABC News nationally one day had a mental health break, became psychotic, and within 3 weeks was homeless on the streets of New York. So things do happen to anybody. As to the federal government now, I will say I'm much happier with the Biden administration's plans with regards to homelessness, partly because they're very data-driven, and he's using the evidence-based practices and trying to fund those practices. I find at HUD, the team at HUD that is in charge of the homeless programs is very, very data-driven. They are trying to incentivize communities to use data-driven, evidence-based practices to address homelessness. They are working very hard to help communities understand what other communities have done that have been successful, but we need more resources.
Ken?
Yes, I was surprised to see or hear that the state of California has a very large budget surplus. And is there an equivalent organization like yours in California that can encourage the governor to spend some of that budget surplus on the various homeless in San Francisco, LA, that we see on TV all the time?
Actually, the governor just funded a very large program, the name of which has just gone out of my head, but he has put in millions and millions and millions of dollars towards trying to build or buy and adaptively reuse existing structures to create housing for homeless. So they are investing in it. I do know LA, is endemic and it has one of the worst homeless problems, partly because for decades they just try to corral all the homeless in one area called Skid Row. And when you have that concentration of people in crisis and don't provide outlets for them to get out of those situations, it compounds and compounds and compounds. And so Los Angeles, the community, the citizenry just passed approved having two bonds issued, one to develop housing for the homeless and the other to have a reserve to fund the services for the homeless. So they are trying to invest in ways to fix the problem. San Francisco, Seattle, some areas that we've seen that have really high homeless rates. The biggest issue is you have two economies. You have people making these insane salaries at IT companies, and then the guy who works at McDonald's trying to live in the same, community. The housing costs are set for these people, and these guys are living in the tents.
Bill, did you have a question?
Do we have any type of program here in this area for inmates being released from prison? Because I know in South Carolina, they have a program called Jump Up, and they meet the inmate as he's being released from prison, and they find a house for him, they find a job for him, and make sure that he's taken care of. Do we have anything like that here?
Actually, Jacksonville has one of the national leaders on helping people, returning citizens is the new term that they're using. They'll help people coming out of the prisons and the jails with finding employment. They've really developed a good network of employers that are willing to take people who've gone through their program and give them a job. And then they work with others to try and help them find housing. There's some other nonprofits, Prisoners for Christ and a few others that have transitional housing so that it's a place when they get released they can go until they can find a place to live, because when you get released there's not a heck of a lot of assistance. It's kind of one of those things, the day they're going to be going, you think we could help them get things together before they walk out the door, but we don't. So the other population that has this similar challenge in that we know they're going to be exiting the system, but we don't really prepare is youth aging out of the foster care system. There's a high preponderance of homelessness among youth who have aged out of foster care.
Right.
I wonder about minorities, and particularly blacks. Do you have a proportion that you regulate for blacks or minorities? Or is it just first come, first serve, or how does that operate?
So
I ran a home for college students, men, and I insisted on 50-50 black and white, but you wouldn't have that option.
No, we have fair housing rules that we have to follow, so we cannot favor one race over the other. I will say on a systems level, across the country, there is a largely disproportionate number of blacks who are homeless, and that is, even if you take into account incomes and levels of poverty, there is still a disproportionately large number of blacks who are homeless. Things are not working. I can't tell you that we know why that is the situation, but it has long been the situation. It is true in Jacksonville, the majority of the homeless are black. They're black men. Single men is our largest population of homeless. For Ability Housing, we take referrals based on vulnerability. So that coordinated entry system does the assessment. They score who's most at risk of passing away on our streets first, and we will take that individual. So we do not screen for race, we screen on vulnerability. I will tell you that part of this data for equity thing that we're doing is, I think there's some challenges in that assessment process that we need to address, because there's nothing intentional associated with it. We're all aware of implicit bias and all of the challenges that we're facing with equity across the board. I think our system has some challenges that need to be addressed.
Excuse me, Shannon, question. We have a daughter who's a judge in Colorado, and Melissa says that the homeless situation has grown quite considerably since the legalization of marijuana. That would probably also possibly be true in Seattle.
I do think there was a large influx of people who moved to Colorado when it was the only state that had that option. So I wouldn't be surprised that if you have a large increase in population, a proportion will be people who will experience homelessness when they arrive, so you will have an increase. Marijuana in and of itself is not a predictor or anything with regards to homelessness, so I would only be guessing as to maybe some of the social dynamics associated with the people that are experiencing this. But my understanding in talking with some people on national things is Colorado faced some challenges when it was the only game in town, and a lot of people went there. Now that it's more prevalent in other areas, You won't have a concentration of people trying to access recreational marijuana as a legal lifestyle.
One other question, how are these people eating?
So many, in Jacksonville, you don't have to worry about going hungry in Jacksonville. We have the shelters, the Trinity and Salzbacher and City Rescue and others have feeding programs. And then Feeding Northeast Florida is a very strong, vibrant food bank system that works with nonprofits across the community. So most of the people are being fed through those programs. There are church and other groups that will come and, open the trunks and give out sandwiches and that type of thing. But the majority of people are going to feeding programs. Or they're working and they're feeding themselves. They just don't have a place to sleep at night. They're going to their car or their tent.
I'd like to go back to the comment you made earlier, Shannon. We've got about 5 minutes left before we wrap up. You said that up through the 70s, we actually had a housing, maybe major surplus, but there was sufficient housing for our society, so we didn't have much homelessness. Certainly not resource-constrained homelessness. I assume that the absence of resources beginning in the 80s existed not just for the bricks and mortar, but also for the services, mental health care, addiction treatment, and the like. Can you talk a little bit about that and what can be done on a national level to address that?
So in the mid-'80s, we had a big push for deinstitutionalization, and it was a very good thing. I mean, we've all at least heard of, if not seen, one flies over the cuckoo's nest. The institutionalization we had in the past dealing with mental health was not something that was going to foster recovery. And so there was a whole plan to create a very robust community-based mental health system. So federally, we defunded the institutions, but we never funded the community-based mental health system. So people were kicked out of state hospitals, some of whom who needed very intensive care needed some other level of institutionalization, others who needed community-based care, but there was nothing there for them. So people think that homelessness was caused by deinstitutionalization because it was done around the same time as we stopped creating more affordable housing for extremely low-income persons, and because those persons are the most visual, easy to recognize and see as homeless persons. So we had, St. Elizabeth's outside DC, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of people sleeping on DC's streets because the state hospital kicked them out. Some of those individuals actually were found sleeping in their old hospital room at the state hospital because that was the only place they'd ever known and they didn't want to leave. So they broke back in. So housing in and of itself for the vast majority of the homeless is the reason, the de-investment in housing is why they're homeless. For that 20% who have very significant mental health and or substance use issues, it's because we don't fund those systems. We don't fund, and Florida is among the worst as well. So federally we created the system, but we never funded it, so it never actually got created. And then at the state level, we are, I think the highest we've ever gotten since I've started doing this was 47th in funding for mental health services. And Northeast Florida is always the worst in the state of Florida.
I'm sorry, Joan? Ken's faster than you, Sally Ann. It must be your knee.
Good. I think it was back in the 70s. I was in real estate, and so we had to pay a lot of attention to low-income housing. And in New Jersey, they passed a law that said that 20% of your housing had to be dedicated to low-income housing. So of course, then you had the housing boom, and all the big developers came in and were building McMansions and stuff. And if they weren't providing that low-income housing on that property, they had to pay the municipality. And there's probably no program like that anymore, but that's a great deal.
I don't know if it still exists. As of a few years ago, it still existed, and it's why New Jersey does not have the same scale of problem. I'm not saying New Jersey doesn't have a problem, but it has a better way of addressing it. And New Jersey is, many of us are very envious of that.
Bob? Just because Ken's standing there. The purpose of current events isn't to solve problems, but it's to make us all more aware of some of the things that are going on current events to make us smarter about the programs that we hear about and the news that we watch and the things we read. I have to say, today, Shannon has exceeded my expectations. I want to give her a big thank you from our group. This is a subject I knew something about, and I've learned more today than I knew. How's that?
I do thank all of you. I did bring some information on ability housing because Tanya would kill me if I didn't. She worked hard on creating these. There are some really pretty pictures of some properties. If you want to see what our housing looks like, you would never know it was anything other than a nice apartment community. So I encourage you, if you ever want a tour, just give me a holler. We love to show off our housing, and our residents love to show off their apartments.
Can we move in?
We're stuck here.
Bob, these keys were found on the floor. Anyone who's lost their keys?
Keys?
Keys.
If they're to a house, be cautious. Our needs here, our needs beyond housing are pretty high as a portion of our need makeup. So this is a perfect example. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
And thank you, Shannon.
My pleasure. Thank you.